So what happened to Earth? War, famine, everything in between, lack of resources. There are countless possibilities, each more terrifying and real than the last. Discover what it was in this episode of Behind the Page. Hi there, welcome to Behind the Page. My name is Jason Arrow. I am the author of Sovereign Genesis, which is my debut novel, yet to be released, and everything that you are reading here on the Sovereign Archives, which is a universe that I am creating from absolute scratch that will be fully encompassed and fully realized, from law down to traffic rules, maybe not that far, currency, politics, everything like that. And I'm using Substack as my my archive, my database, everything that will hold all the information so that when I'm writing these books, it can be called upon, and also for your entertainment as well. Today, we'll be looking at Earth's final years, a more in-depth analysis at the article that I released, the very first article that I released here on Substack, for looking at all the real-world influences for the demise of Earth in my new series, Sovereign. So we'll see how many times I'll say new series, Sovereign. Why did Earth have to perish, and what drove that idea? So let's start with the first part. Why did Earth have to perish? I did toy with the idea of Earth being around still. I always found that in most sci-fi series, give or take, Earth was never a thing, but it didn't exist anymore. And I always sort of wondered, well, why is that? For me, it's more so the fact that if Earth survived, I feel like there was hope for it to be the home base for Earth and for it to recover, I guess, which goes against the main thematic idea that I had for the series in the first place, which was, why do we as human beings keep repeating the same mistakes when it comes to war, racism, sexism, anything like this, any of these themes, not one in particular, just any of them. Why do we continually make the same mistakes without change, basically? And so, I went along with this idea, and then the more I thought about keeping Earth around, it lost traction pretty quickly, because it became hopeful in the sense that we could reclaim what we had lost, or develop something new. And so instead, I took the idea of Earth and I built it into a society on the opposite end of the galaxy, which I have yet to actually even talk about in the Sovereign Archives, but I will let you know here because you are watching. It's called Algaia, and the reason I called it Algaia is because I called it its alternate Gaia, so alternate Earth. It's a version of Earth where all of these things don't exist. All of these things it's the Earth that we would want our Earth to be. And essentially, these people have discovered a way to live without any of these sort of discriminatory things or war, political issues. Having said that, they do have their own things. They're not perfect. And they, had struggles at the beginning of their colonization. But that was the main influence for that. I went, you know what? I will put that hope in a totally different planet. And that's what the first book deals with, which is probably why I haven't written anything about it just yet. That's why Earth had to go. I felt the need for it to be there was a little too, it created too much of a positive spin on things. And I wanted it to be, real and better than where we are, but also there's a couple of repeating themes that come up. So for example, why does an empire exist when we know that empires aren't a good thing? Something like that, which I'll go into in another podcast. But issues like that, okay, so if we're going to have something that a political structure we don't even have anymore, why would that exist in, 2,000, 3,000 years from now? And there's very, very good reason for that. And what drove the idea? So that was looking at the reason for the series, which is, why do we keep repeating the same mistakes? And that was the whole reason for the series. I'll look at some points in the article and look at, so you can even see from the start at 2050, the Net Zero Climate Initiative, which is based off real world stuff that we're dealing with right now, very much topically right now. Looking at resources, and this I wrote this 2 to 3 years ago. So this is well before any of this started happening. And and there you go. It just goes to show you that question that I had of why do we keep repeating the same mistakes is it's very evident, it's very clear. It's something that we're still having to deal with literally right now. And I predicted something that wasn't even that hard for me to really predict. It was pretty clear that something like this was going to happen at some point, and here we are. It just happened a lot sooner than I thought it would. And so I referenced the 2050 Net Zero Climate Initiative. In the early years of the 21st century, it became abundantly clear within the scientific community that the climate crisis facing Earth needed to be rectified by the year 2050. And it looks like something like that's going to get further and further and further away from our grasp. Then I started to look into things that, okay, so if we have a Net Zero Climate Initiative, what does that look like? If I know that Earth is going to be destroyed in some way, I know that I'm going to need to look at how does that work with the Net Zero Climate Initiative. So I'm going to look at resources, of course, and it's probably going to be oil. So I hate to be like a bit of like a doomsday prophet here, but just to make it feel realistic, this is what I've gone with. So in 21-24, we go into an economic downturn, which is relatively major temperature shifts have started happening, and a lot of the countries have ignored the target. So in the one above, a few countries either missed or completely ignored the target deadline. This set into motion a series of unavoidable events that would eventually destroy Earth through a series of devastating natural disasters around 2262, destroying all life upon its surface. So in 21-24 is an economic downturn, which is, temperature shifts, abnormally longer seasons, drought after drought began to create worry among the world's governments. Like they didn't know that this was going to happen. They were told about it. Mass public outcry and protests, riots, they made the government start to notice what was happening around them. It always seems, tying back into that question of why do we keep repeating the same mistakes? It always seems to be that way of like governments are warned. They're warned. Scientists warn them. People warn them. And then the people in charge, they never listen. And so it's only at the very last second when things are absolute dire straits, then they start listening and things start changing. They try to push it until it's the very last moment, and then they shift the narrative. So I went, okay, let's do that in this, because it's a very realistic way to go about it. As the world slowly realizes the climate crisis was looming, the UN began trialing initiatives that may help reverse the crisis outcome, or at least significantly delay it. While those initiatives helped for some time, in the better part of 50 years, some governments began to fall into massive debt without a viable means of exporting to other countries oil, gas, and mining, which is really topical. Which is really topical right now, because as those resources start to dwindle, trade starts to dwindle. When trade starts to dwindle, the money goes. When the money goes, more resources go. And so the system continues. Led by the US of A, a contingent of major oil exporters began a series of petitions and proposals to continue import-export practices and mining to help subsidize some of the debt the countries faced throughout the net zero era. Just a way to combat and get some more funds in and basically get trade back up and running. Unsurprisingly, the UN denied all those activities because it goes against the fact that they're like, we're having a climate crisis right now. We're in dire straits. I know we're having an economic downturn, but we need to find another way to do this that doesn't involve putting more pollutants into the atmosphere or, fracking, anything like that. All things that we know are bad for the planet. The UN denied all those activities and requests that all the countries stay the course, wait until the climate stabilizes, which, if COVID taught us anything, doesn't actually take as long as we would think. Throughout, what was it? I think it took about 6 to 7 months and the ozone started to repair itself. Like the world, nature has a way of repairing itself. This is turning into an activist channel, but that's not what this is about. This is just part of the story. They requested all the denies and said to stay the course and wait until the climate stabilizes, or an advancement in the technology would help them be able to do so. Begrudgingly, the countries did agree. Again, it's very obvious that this was happening at this point, to the point that crops are dying, unnecessary amount of storms, everything that we have been told would happen is starting to happen at this point at 2152. The countries did agree, and it would seem that the world would stay the course for the time being. In 2153, so, a couple of years later, many countries, including Russia, Saudi Arabia, and the USA, began privately trading goods through back channels to help subsidize their debt, ultimately mining in secret. The reason I chose these countries, let's be clear about why I chose these countries. When I was doing research, I looked at what the prime exporters of oil are in the world, consumers of oil and exporters of oil. And the three that came up with pretty readily was Russia, Saudi Arabia, and the USA. Whether that's changed or not, I'm not entirely sure. I did do quite a bit of research on it, but again, this is only law, so it's a vague look at what countries look at it. I didn't look too in-depth into it. It's not about who, being right or wrong here. I just wanted to have some semblance of reality in the basis of what I'm constructing. So again, if that's not actually accurate, don't come for me, but please let me know if that isn't actually accurate. But yes, Russia, Saudi Arabia, and the USA were the ones that came up. And I think I chose the USA because, sorry for any Americans out there, my bad. They began privately trading goods through back channels to subsidize their debt. This was, of course, not to last. As the price set for such goods became so astronomically high, they could not truly service their debts, creating further problems. Obviously, now we're talking things like inflation, problems like that. If something is so rare at this point, it's going to cost a hell of a lot, and then you'd only be spending more money that you don't have to make it. It's a self-defeating, self-fulfilling prophecy. Eventually, all trade halted around 2152, the year before private trade and global unrest. As keeping such trade secrets became unviable, and as the climate began to shift negatively again, the world took note. So Russia, Saudi Arabia, USA, these are big land masses, and if they start taking part in illegal mining, trade comes up again, it's going to be clear that someone is breaking the rules. Again, the science behind this, not entirely sure how obvious this would be, but I'm sure there would be ways for countries, scientists, to be able to figure out that someone's causing problems, further problems. So international hearings and sanctions began, creating further debt issues for the participating countries. So they got smacked, basically. They got sanctions from pretty much every country in the world. As the debt grew, citizens, actually, to be honest, just going back a bit, I probably should have included Australia in this, because they do a lot of, and I live in Australia, I'm Australian. They do a lot of things that the USA does. So I probably should have put Australia in this if I was going to be really realistic about it, but can't throw my own country under the bus, like, come on. As the debt grew, citizen unrest grew. So now we're getting to the point of now it's starting to really affect the global population as a whole, as opposed to just the governments themselves. Poverty and homelessness began to run rife in most countries, and within a few years, the global population began to dwindle around 3.6% over the next 5 years. I looked at the maths behind what is actually a large decrease of the population. 3.6% was like middle to high ground percentage of global population dwindling, especially over the time frame of 5 years. I didn't want it to be too drastic, because then there's not enough people to keep things functioning, and research and all those sorts of things start to really get affected. So 3.6% was the best one I could come up with. Along with this, communication broke down between the nations. Several countries began detaching themselves from the international community, opting to focus locally. So now the global community began to collapse. And now essentially we went backwards in time. We went back to a more simple time of just focusing on our own country's needs, which, for all intents and purposes, was what kind of happened with COVID. Other than the internet, of course, we kind of became more insular. Countries became a little more insular. And in this instance, it's completely not so, like, international trade, no longer a thing. Every single country started to focus on themselves, their own citizens, their own crop yields, things like that. Everything worked internally. At 2200, so 2200, the final war began. After years of following guidelines, many countries once categorized as developed nations now fell into developing status. The USA began funneling that money it had left into arms trade and fortification with Russia and Saudi Arabia. So they started to basically become oil slingers, and they were like, well, if no one's going to let us have oil and it's completely destroying the world and the climate's still a little bit shit, then I guess we're going to go to war, which rang alarm bells around the world, because, as you know, the USA and Russia have always had a bit of a contentious, is that the right word? Yeah. I've always had a bit of, a strained relationship. So for them to team up, especially with Saudi Arabia, knowing how much, issues the USA can cause in the Middle East, that definitely pricked some ears up. On Independence Day, July 4th, the USA used its Independence Day as a guise to launch the majority of its naval fleet into the North Atlantic, masked as a naval display so that on July 5th, during Venezuelan Independence Day, they launched an attack on their country, Venezuela, to obtain their massive oil reserves, because obviously Venezuela has a ton of oil reserves. The attack was synchronized with Russia and Saudi Arabia, each attacking its target. Russia attacked Canada from the west with help from US ground forces from the south, while Saudi Arabia invaded its neighbor Iraq, all for oil. Within hours, an international emergency was declared and the world was once again at a full-scale war. All of this is speculation, obviously. All of this is completely made up, obviously. But more to the point that this is just based off grassroots entry-level research, looking at who has the most oil. Let's just theorize what could happen in a situation like this. This is all just theory. This isn't trying to throw anyone under the bus for anything, just to be clear. 2210, the fall of the modern world. Near the final days of the war, desperation grew amongst, so this is 10 years into the thing, desperation grew amongst the aggressor nations, USA, Russia, Saudi Arabia, as pressure mounted on their borders and supplies grew thin again. A final threat was made globally that the use of nuclear weapons would begin if the Allied nations did not back down and obey their request to disband the UN and cease all bans on fossil fuel trade and mining. The UN disbanded immediately, obviously under the threat of these three powerhouse nations with huge armies and massive nuclear reserves. But the UK, many other nations were adamant about keeping all bans in place until a new technology was discovered to help repair the current climate situation. One such technology was being developed between South Korea and Japan, always Japan. Always Japan, over the last 30 years. Obviously, they lead in a lot of our technological discoveries, so it only seemed right. South Korea and Japan, over the last 30 years, they had been developing a technology to fix the planet, basically. However, Russia refused to back down, stating that the world could not wait any longer. And on September 1st, 2210, Russia launched 7 nuclear warheads directly at London, the death toll in the millions. At this point, Russia was like, we need to get back to the way things were. The US was kind of listening to the idea of the fact that they had been developing this for the last 30 years and was sort of open to the idea. But Russia was like, no, you're backing down, which is disgraceful. You're backing down, which is embarrassing. As we know, can sometimes be a pretty big point in Russian politics sometimes, is about that being, stand up and standing by your word and not showing weakness. And so Russia refused to. The remaining international stock markets crashed, so that was the end of the stock exchange, and the final war ended with all nations ceasing communication indefinitely. Dead silence. So while there was internet, things like that before, there is nothing anymore. 2193, Project Exodus. So Project Exodus, of course, Exodus meaning great adventure, leaving, that sort of thing, is now we're heading out into outer space. Before the final war began, so this predates this. So Project Exodus has been happening for quite a while at this point. Before the final war began, several high-profile private investors, government organizations from the UK, Japan, and South Korea, to name a few, there was many more than this. I didn't want to make a big list though. And what remained of the world's international space agencies met in secret in Switzerland, of course, to discuss humankind's final mission. A few years earlier, a discovery had been made about Proxima Centauri b. As we know, Proxima Centauri b is our closest neighbor that is the most viable for life. I think a lot of research has been done about the fact that it's tidally locked and things like that actually mean that it's probably not that great for it, but it's the most prominent one so far that's close enough. So that's why I went with Proxima Centauri b. And its viability for life had improved drastically over the years. So I literally just said that. It was no secret in the scientific community that Earth would be decimated within the coming years, either by war, climate, or both. And that's pretty clear at this point. The major problem facing them with space travel, of course, as the money was a huge factor and money was a huge problem at this point, only one ship could be made with a maximum of 10,000 souls on board total, enough to continue human life elsewhere in the galaxy. Again, this is based on research, finding that apparently 10,000 people is enough of a genetic pool to repopulate a planet without there being like any sort of crossbreeding, without there being any sort of genetic malformations or like DNA issues between the population. So 10,000 is apparently the best one. Enough to continue human life elsewhere in the galaxy. So construction began later that year in Australia because of the fact that it has landmass to do so. And I think that's the reason also why I didn't put Australia in this. I was like, there needs to be a big enough place to build these structures and put them up into space, because the pieces were launched up there and then constructed up there and put together, basically like a big IKEA package. And then the biggest pieces were, of course, just constructed up there. So Australia basically turned into a big launching pad, using the middle of the desert as the way to do that. I didn't say that in this, but that's what happened. Finding a solution, construction began later that year in Australia, while research continued with a two-pronged approach. Finding a solution for Earth, just in case, and also a viable propulsion method for Project Exodus. Now, as we know, that's one of the biggest problems with space travel. As you can see with Artemis 2, it's still taking them 4 days to get to the moon. Is it 4 days? Yes, 4 days to get to the moon. So wild. Like it's space is huge. So due to its sheer size, the ship was to be built in pieces on the ground and then assembled in space. I did say it, just because building things in space, it was way more expensive and incredibly difficult to do, as one can imagine, and very dangerous. This was ironically to be the one time in human history that governments of the world and private organizations, and so the private sector, worked in complete harmony to create something bigger than themselves, which I found to be a bit of a depressing footnote. The fact that that's what it takes for us to actually work together as a unit. In 2011 to 2240, we had cultural regression. As the years dragged on, the world regressed to a simpler time. Farming, toiling the land became the most valued professions, and science was seen as more of a luxury that could not be afforded. So obviously, this is kind of leading into what happened in Interstellar. Obviously, farming became very popular thing, and science just was not studied at all anymore, because people were focusing on keeping themselves alive, which I think is a very realistic look at what would probably happen. I think technology, science, all of those advancements would probably be completely neglected and thrown to the side, and left for very few people, in the face of like the demise of the planet and food scarcity, resource scarcity, things like that. I think that's a very realistic way to look at it. So I went, yep, let's do that. Not that I got it from them, it just seems the most realistic way to do it, and then realized, oh yeah, also Interstellar does that as well. Ironically, due to the devastating impact of the final war, which had ended by this point, any work done to undo the climate crisis, actually, I don't know if it was done just yet, let's read on. Any work done to undo the climate crisis was all but destroyed, and the final stages of a full-blown climate crisis had begun. So at this point, it was like committed. This is probably a lot later than what it would happen realistically. I just had a lot of things to get through. And so I was like, let's delay the science of it and the nature of it so that it happens in a more like poetically story-based fashion that feels like it just works better. Anyway, so that's where the art comes into it and destroys the reality. Most countries experienced incredibly long hot summers lasting 5 to 6 months at a time, and all major population centers were pushed to coastlines while inland cities were abandoned. So at this point, the construction of the AARC, which is what the thing was called, the spaceship was called, just all went up into space at this point. A lot of the major pieces had actually been completed, but it was important that they finish the rest of it up in space because it was just too hot on the planet's surface. So by this point, 2241, the AARC had been completed. The AARC standing for, it's AARC, not AARK. Anthropoi, astronomical redistribution craft. Anthropoi meaning the Greek word, or the ancient Greek word, I believe, for people, human beings. I believe men is also one of it, but I mean human beings and people. So the ship, now named the ARK, pronounced ARC, ARK, was finally complete, and the search for crew, personnel, and fertility candidates had begun. At this point, there was a real difficulty in finding trained scientists and other specialized professions, including doctors, professors, technicians, and students. And students, by that I mean not like apprentice-based students in terms of physical labor, but students in terms of college college level or studying sciences. So at this point, it was very hard to find people who were doing this. There was one person in particular, Victor Kane, bright young man, was selected as the lead of the project. As its captain, leaning all major decisions on his shoulders, including crew selection, was responsible for training of his successor. Victor Kane is... the reason being was that he had very rare degrees at this point, like social sciences, looking at like, government structure, things like that, just science in general, like as a technician, engineer, things like that. He had a lot of degrees that he had focused on instead of focusing on farming that he had accrued. Because again, the degrees that people were doing, things looking at things like farming or like practices in farming and excavation, things like that, they were so much more sought after, and therefore those were the most expensive things to actually study. Whereas things like engineering, things like that, they were looked at as, the cheaper things to study. And so now the hierarchy had shifted in terms of like how valued these professions had become. And so he went, okay, well, I'm going to do the ones that are least valued, because he was a little poorer. And so that's how he ended up being the lead of this. Over the next few years, the final team and participants were selected. So his crew, he selected, as well as the final participants for Project Exodus. On October 12th, 2251, Project Exodus launched on its 85-year journey to Proxima Centauri b, carrying with it what would be the last humans in the galaxy, leaving behind their dying planet. Earth was all but forgotten at this point. And yeah, that's the Earth's final years. That's the entire thing. And it's sort of explaining what the sections were behind it. While we head into segment 2, please don't forget to, subscribe if you haven't already. And of course, share this podcast if you found it really interesting or funny or stupid. Either one of those reasons is good. Of course, you can find a lot more on the Sovereign Archives in terms of lore if you want to get ahead of the podcast series.
Key influences and why so much depth to the lore.
So the key influences, at the time I was in Abu Dhabi doing Hamilton. I played Alexander Hamilton in the Australian production and the international production of Hamilton. And we, wild fact, I know. We were there, and the unrest in Israel had only just started. And I remember thinking, that was when I had the thought, I was like, why do we keep making the same mistakes? As I was watching it unfold, I just remember thinking, this needs to be like looked at. Like someone needs to study why, as a society, we keep repeating history, and why that's something that we do. And of course, I don't want to get into that too heavily, but that was one of the key influences for why I started this in the first place. I don't reference that at all. Obviously, in the story as an overarching narrative, there is references to everything that has happened in the world. All the great wars are referenced in some aspect. There's a look at segregation, but this time the segregation is between classes, not race. Which again is something that's very realistically happening at this point. I mean, our whole economy is divulging into, I believe they called it a K structure, where it's just, you'll either get richer or poorer, and that's the options. There's no crossing. If I read that properly, it was something that I learned on Substack, actually. I should find that article and share it. So yeah, that was what I was looking at the most at this point. The more I looked into it, the more I saw these patterns repeat, and the more this became like a very viable question to base something on. And I went, okay, I've always wanted to write a sci-fi epic. Usually I write it in terms of screenplay or a theater piece, or, a play or anything like that. Whereas this time I went, I'm going to write a novel this time, because it's it's encapsulated in one person. I don't need thousands of people to make it happen, or hundreds of thousands of dollars either. So yeah, that's why I went about that. It made a really good thesis question, I believe, for the creation of Sovereign, and putting it through a sci-fi lens, it makes it really, really, really apparent. Because you go, hang on a sec, don't we do that now? Doesn't that happen now? Don't these things happen all the time? And the more you look at it, the more the question comes up, the more you go, oh, okay, I see the cross-examination of what's happening here. I see the cross-examination you're trying to do. So yeah, that's part of it. But why so in depth with the lore in the first place? Look, obviously the archives go into currency, politics, war cabinets, government. They go into the structure of the armies and the air force. Well, not the air force, but the space forces or whatever you would call them, and why it goes into such detail. Well, the thing is, as I was writing the novel, I knew that I was going to have to deal with currency at some point. I knew I was going to have to deal with politics at some point. I knew I was going to have to deal with military at some point, and so I made them. I didn't want to just make things. I didn't want to just make things unnecessarily. I had two worlds at the time. I had Algaia and had Sovereign. Sovereign being the name of the series, but an actual place as well. And I went, okay, well, I need to look at how these things are constructed. Because otherwise I'll get to a point in the book, which I was finding already, where I'd need to be like, okay, well, I actually need to construct this thing. So now I've got to look at world building. And so that's how I go about it. That's my world building process. I write and I get to a point where it sticks and I go, I really need to actually know what I'm talking about because I might reference it again and I need to reference it clearly and I need to know what it is. And so I just world build as necessity breeds, basically. And I find that's a good way to do it because I don't like getting lost. I forget the name for it, but there is a name for it where you just sort of get lost in world building. And I was finding that at one point, there was one or two things I created. I was like, no, that's unnecessary. I don't really need to do that. That's getting away from the point, I think. I had to look at how space travel worked. I had to look at the research for that. I had to figure out how I'm going to make this seem believable. Because my sci-fi is not by any means hard sci-fi, but it also isn't soft sci-fi either. It's like a medium hard, which is a terrible way to describe it, but that's the way I try to look at the sci-fi that I'm creating. It's character-driven, medium hard sci-fi. That's the best way to look at it, I think. Yeah, and sort of looking into how these structures work intergalactically. Like, how do you run an empire intergalactically? How does that work? And so I looked at how older empires worked and how they ended up crumbling, which is usually to do with the dissemination of information. That they couldn't, their policies and procedures or how they wanted things to run couldn't reach the far ends of their empire. And so the things started to collapse. So communication is a really important part of creating an empire. So I went, okay, well, how are we going to now we have the same problem again. On Earth, we wouldn't have that issue because obviously we have the internet, we have phone calls, we have radio, we have so many different mediums, like we have Morse code, for God's sake. Like we have so many different mediums of communication that would not be a problem anymore. But intergalactically, it would be a problem. We'd be basically back in those ages again, across much greater distances. So I had to look at how that works. And so that's where the Skyway came into it, which is, the natural, realistically natural structures, filaments that exist in the galaxy, that are like, it's just like gravity holds these areas in like there's like a tension to these particular areas of space for no reason. They just look like filaments. You can see them. And they exist in real life. So I went, great, that's the Skyway. That's how it's going to work. Things are going to travel differently through those places, but you have to access it through a certain way. You can't just fly through and you just pick up speed. There's a way of going about it. And so all things like that, the technology and all that, it's all bred from necessity, but it is cascading though. One thing creates another problem, creates another problem, creates another problem. And I keep having to answer these issues. And then I found I was like, this book is taking forever to finish because I can't create these things like it's just taking forever. But I did finally finish my first draft, so I'm very happy about that. That's how that all came about, and how I world build and how I plan on world building moving forward. That's all for this episode of Behind the Page. If you want to learn more about Sovereign or any articles that are within the Sovereign archives, please leave a comment. And of course, share with whoever you think would be interested in discovering a universe as it's built live, basically. So yes, if there's an article you want me to discuss in Behind the Page, please comment below, or any aspect of Sovereign that you would like me to discuss. Please ask questions and I can answer them in the next episode of Behind the Page. Thank you for taking your time to watch, and I'll see you next time on Behind the Page. See ya.